Good afternoon, everybody. Hello, I hope everyone is getting in okay. I'm John Horwich, the president and CEO of Easterseals, DC, Maryland, and Virginia. Our vision is to create a hopeful, inclusive community where all people realize their potential and live meaningful lives. Realizing our vision of hope during what has been such a challenging time requires coping skills. It's been an incredibly traumatic time. Total deaths in the US were about 500,000, or almost 20% higher than normal in 2020. Add to that unemployment, underemployment, changes in school and schedule, and our children need support. That's why it's such an honor for us to present today's webinar. We have an amazing panel of experts, including Bonnie Carroll, the president and founder of Tragedy Assistance Program for Survivors. Bonnie is a Presidential Medal of Freedom recipient for her work turning the tragedy of the death of her husband into a purposeful effort to create what is today the major national program providing compassionate care for all who are grieving the death of a service member. Sabrina Huda is the project director for Sesame workshop initiatives that reach our most vulnerable and underserved kids and their families. As such, she works with key partner organizations who are committed to helping all kids become smarter, stronger, and kinder. She leads Sesame Street's initiatives for military families and many strategic initiatives, including health emergencies in COVID response, as well as racial equity and social justice. Vicki J. is the CEO of the National Alliance for Grieving Children. Her career in hospice and death care spans 25 years, championing services for individuals and families before and after life-altering events. And finally, Dr. Shea Lott is the lead clinician at the Stephen A. Cohen Military Family Clinic at Easterseals. He's a licensed clinical neuroforensic psychologist with experience providing comprehensive mental health care for children and adolescents, couples, and families. He's dedicated to improving the health and quality of life for all by focusing on the social and cultural factors that impact development, as well as psychological and behavioral disorders. Now I'm pleased to turn the program over to Darnell Burtin. Darnell serves as Vice President of Development at Easterseals, DC, Maryland, Virginia, and also as the father of three. We're hoping that he'll ask many of the questions that you in the audience want to have addressed. But if you're logged into Zoom, please feel free to ask questions as well in the Q&A box. Darnell?
John, thank you as always for that wonderful introduction. This conversation, as I always say, is not about me. Here's how we're going to run today. It's similar to how we've run our panels in the past. I'm going to introduce all of our wonderful panelists, allow them 3 to 5 minutes to introduce themselves, and then we're going to jump into some questions. But really, we want to have this more as an open dialogue. And so we may start off with the question, we may hear something in that topic, and we may go in a different direction. Also, for those of you that are participating as onlookers, the Q&A box is there for you. Please write your questions, ask away, and hopefully our panelists will be paying attention to that Q&A box as well and can answer some of those questions for you. So without further ado, let me start off and introduce, there's only one gentleman on here today, so we're not gonna let him go first. We're gonna start with Bonnie, and then we're gonna go to the gentleman. I know he was gonna think I was gonna pick him first, but we're gonna start off with Bonnie, and then we're gonna go to Shea. Bonnie?
Darnell, thank you so much. And it's great to be here. And, TAPS, the Tragedy Assistance Program for Survivors, is the national organization for all those who are grieving the death of a military loved one. What we found in caring for the families of America's fallen heroes is that in most cases, that death involved a significant trauma, and children are going through multiple layers of loss. So early on, TAPS created a program just for the kids who were grieving not only the death of a loved one, primarily a parent, but they were also now grieving a disconnect from their military community, when their family would probably ultimately move away from that military installation to another location. So we created what we call the Good Grief Camps, a chance for kids to come together, connect with others, to know that they're not alone, to learn coping strategies, to understand that they're now transitioning from being a dependent to being part of a living legacy of American service and sacrifice, and learning coping strategies that are appropriate for their age group, and to really acknowledge and honor the multiple layers of loss that they're experiencing. So that's a little bit about what TAPS does, but the lessons that we have learned actually can inform a lot of the experiences of kids today, especially those grieving with a COVID loss in their family, because that has come with many complicating factors as well. So thanks, Darnell, for allowing me to share about our organization.
Bonnie, I appreciate you starting us off. You know, I want to jump in and share something about me, but I want to make sure you guys are first. But so we're going to jump to Shea now, since you're the gentleman on the panel. You get to go, and then we'll finish with the other fantastic folks. I'm just giving you a hard time, Shea. Go ahead.
I understand, no worries. Thank you, Darnell. And as John mentioned earlier, I am the lead clinician here at the Cohen Clinic, which is partnered with Easterseals. What we primarily do is provide mental health care to post 9/11 veterans, active duty veterans, and their family members. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to strengthen the mental health outcomes and complement existing supports that are already in the network. What we envision is to ensure that every veteran and their family is able to obtain access to high quality, effective care that enables them to lead fulfilling and productive lives. And so we're trying to heal those mental health wounds because they are just as difficult to heal as the physical wounds that many of our veterans and their families have sustained over their lifetime. And so what we try and do is we use evidence-based practices along with access to the comprehensive care case management that we provide to deal with these other kinds of stresses that people may have, like unemployment, finances, housing, and legal issues, actually. So our skilled staff has experience working with not only the veterans, but also working with their families. And so I appreciate you all inviting me here, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Well, Shea, you have the longest title in the smart people title, so we had to make sure we put you up there. That whole neuro piece is, you know, I joke, but it's really we're probably going to converse about here. Sabrina, you next, and then Vicki. I promise, I just had to make you last because you got the big Dallas star behind you.
I gotcha.
So, all right, Sabrina, your chance.
Thank you, Darnell, and it's such an honor to be here with you all. I always start with apologizing that it's me and not a Muppet when it's Sesame Street, but that's what you get today. You know, I also like to share that, you know, when you think Sesame Street and you think trauma, you might take a step back like, oh, and, you know, just sharing that, you know, we are a nonprofit and I work in this amazing department where we get to create free bilingual resources for all families and providers. And by providers, I mean anyone who serves families in a way, in some capacity. You know, for over 50 years now, Sesame has used the power of our Muppets to help kids and families cope with really tough topics, you know, especially things like trauma. You wouldn't think we'd be in this space, but we've learned that addressing childhood trauma is such a unique opportunity for us. And there's resources for older kids, but the impact that we've learned over the years that it has on the 0 to 6 age is so profound, and it could really impact their whole trajectory in life. So that's really why we are so honored to be able to do this work. And also help parents along the way build resilience as they help kids heal. So I know there'll be opportunities to talk about the resources later, but what I did want to highlight is all the resources I wanted to be shared today is really around this website, and I'll share it in the chat for everyone joining today, called Sesame Street in Communities. It's a website for parents and providers. It's for military families, but it's for all families who've been through something tough. All of our content is free, it's bilingual. We have 3 big buckets of areas to address difficult conversations and tough topics like trauma, parental addiction, foster care, incarceration, a lot of those ACEs that lead to trauma. As well as healthy habits, ABCs, 1, 2, 3s. And the website is filled with multimedia resources such as videos and printables, storybooks, but more importantly, articles and resources parents can really have for strategies and talking points to talk through these difficult things. And I'd love to start there. And then as we talk more, I hope we have an opportunity to share some of the more intimate details about the resources we have.
Fantastic, Sabrina. I appreciate that. And so definitely last and definitely not least, but Ms. Vicki J.
Thank you. And it's no problem that I get to go after all these wonderful people. You know, I have spent a lifetime studying children. We can learn so much from them if we're just open to it. They have great insights and are more open than we are on many topics, including death and dying and the things surrounding that. And it's just been a privilege to learn from them. I represent the National Alliance for Grieving Children, and we're a national network of professionals across the United States and beyond that have an interest in supporting grieving children. So whatever hat you wear, whatever profession you're in, whatever role you have, it's our goal to support you, to equip you, to make sure that you are comfortable with the topics, that you have the resources at your fingertips that you need to be able to journey with that child through the experiences that they have. And we do know that all children grieve. And as simple as that statement is, I would say that it's not always been recognized that way. Many times we would have liked to assume that kids are so resilient, they're going to just bounce back, and we don't really need to worry about them because eventually they'll be okay. And I applaud Easterseals and TAPS and Sesame Street for taking on the task of helping everybody understand that kids do indeed grieve, and they do need our support. They may grieve differently than we do as adults, but they need to be recognized as grievers. They need to be included in the grief process, part of the family dynamics, the rituals, all the decision-making. Any piece or part that we can involve a child is very important to NAGC. So that's kind of what we work towards. We have resources. Again, just like Sabrina said, we try to use kid-friendly resources for the kids, but we also support caregivers on a variety of topics. So it's all the way from traumatic death, military loss, which will be talked about on this call, but many others. And most loss for a child doesn't come with a single loss. It has multiple layers of it. So we also try to support those other layers that accompany any major loss. It's an honor and privilege to be here. And I would say that we'll talk later about resources. Our resources are across the nation, and they're usually just a button away.
Well, thank you, Vicki. Just so you guys know, just to level set again, any of the panelists, if you have resources or if you have links, please share that in the chat box. Or you can, please share that in the chat box, or you can share with the folks on the backside, and they'll share that information for you. I thought a good way to start off might be to share my own personal experience here during this pandemic. I'm the father of 3, and I have very different ages. I have a freshman in college, a freshman in high school, and an 8-year-old. So I have a big swath of children, right? Don't everybody's eyebrow raised at me. Never do that. That's a big, big gap, right? But the challenging part through this pandemic is, while I thought the youngest would be the most impacted, the eldest was the most impacted, who was in college. And she went away to school, and while she wasn't seeing deaths, there was a real fear about what COVID was, right? And so she spent her first semester on campus, really, what she said, locked in a room studying because they didn't have the classroom. So there was this trauma of being locked up. And then someone got COVID, and there were still these kids that were like, well, it's just COVID and I'm not concerned about it. And then she heard that one of my cousins had passed in Chicago from COVID. And so her fear again exponentially rose. And so she asked to kind of come home. And so she came home during the second semester, but there was still this real fear. And then my second child, his trauma was, man, I was going to be a freshman, I'm going to play sports, and they shut everything down. And so there was this kind of shutting down of, what do I do? And why is this happening to me? And did I do something wrong? And it wasn't not anything to do with him, right? And so there's this older trauma of, I could contract this and bring this home, and I know someone who's passed. And then there's this middle kid who's like, it's not fair, and I'm losing everything, kind of shutting down. And the younger one has thrived. He's like, I don't want to ever go back to school. I'm doing great, and I got an hour lunch break now. Why would I ever want to go sit in the classroom again? So I use that to start off with our first question. And the question is, after a year long of pandemic, necessary restrictions, what advice would you give to parents to help their child adjust to this COVID and post-COVID world? You know, hearing me and then talking to other parents. I'll start off with Shea.
So the way that I approach this with families is I tell them, have the conversation. And so we typically will talk about what COVID is, how it's transmitted, how do we keep ourselves safe, and be open and be on the level of the child. So since you have the 3 different levels, you're going to explain this to each child differently. And so as you're having this conversation with the children, you're wanting to also let them know how it's impacting you. And so what that does is it will normalize their reaction to the events that are happening around them, so they don't feel as if they're the only ones who's going through this alone. And one way to kind of keep children, even adults in a way, from developing long-lasting mental health symptoms is to encourage them to continue to do some of the things that are safe, and encourage them to engage in their environment that is safe, so they don't take away from this, that my environment is unsafe and I can't be in that space and I need to retreat and not be involved in these kinds of areas. So as much as we can, which is very difficult during COVID, keep some semblance of normalcy in the life of children and adults really does benefit them in regards to being able to overcome. And so what it does is it develops and builds this hope that things will change, and this optimism, and all of that leads to resiliency.
Vicki or Sabrina or Bonnie, please chime in.
You know, one thought I would add is follow their lead. Tell a child what they want to know, you know, so it's not a time for us to, on any difficult subject, it's not a time where we just tell all, but we have touch points of conversation. So I totally agree with have the conversation, start the conversation, and then go as far as the child is comfortable, then check back in and see how they've processed that information, and then go to the next step, the next level. But one thing that's been very apparent, it was true through 9/11 and now through COVID, is making sure that the last thing your child does is not watch the news, the 10 o'clock news. And if they do have opportunity to view the screen or hear, make sure you help them understand and process what they've seen and heard. So because their imagination is so much worse or bigger sometimes, that the picture in their head is actually scarier than the reality once they understand and have it explained to them.
I would just add one more thing, and exactly what Shea and Vicki were saying is when COVID happened and for Sesame Street to respond, you know, our curriculum was so much around health at first because it's all about the healthy practices. But for the younger kids, we're like, oh my goodness, they're, you know, missing their friends. They're seeing their neighbors get sick. Then it's the grief. I'm sure, Vicki, you've of course addressed that in your work. And then it's things are reopening, but things are different, right? So I think right now, especially the 2 strategies we're still working on in the content we're creating, something Shea, you said, is how do we instill positivity in our kids, especially the younger ones? So, you know, there's going to be so much uncertainty, so many difficult moments. So we want to, you know, one theme we have, we do a lot with our military kids, especially with all the transitions military families go through, is, you know, instill a sense of adventure in some of the changes, right? There's negative things happening, but while some things change, some things still stay the same. And also flexibility, you know, even now, I think with what we've been hearing as adults in the news the last week, do we wear a mask? Do we not? Are we, if we go to Walmart, it's one thing. If we go to Chipotle, it's another. But all of that, like lingering uncertainty, making sure that we build everyday flexible thinking for our young children so that they can be prepared to really address those when those unexpected situations happen. They have to problem solve and think about things in new ways. They feel a little bit more prepared.
Sabrina, I just echo that so much. And what we've heard from our kids is they love talking about not what they can't do or the have-nots, but what they can do. They now have better access to both parents around the clock and their caregivers, and they have freedom of hours sometimes that they didn't have before. And, you know, they like talking about the positive things for sure.
Yeah, Bonnie, I'm not sure if that's a positive with the freedom of access to parents. You know, you know, the way that my kids now are like, well, we just expect you to be here, knock, knock. So they just walk in. I'm joking. but it is really, you know, and maybe that leads us into, and I don't want to steal any time away from anyone else. Bonnie, did you want to say anything before I go?
I love what everyone has shared. And, you know, this is a unique circumstance that the entire world is going through. I think it'll be the only time, certainly in our lifetime, we'll see a phenomenon like this, where, you know, whether you're in Kathmandu, Nepal, or Delhi, India, or London, England, everyone is talking about masks and vaccines. And so it is an opportunity also to normalize a little bit that we all have something in common that we can come together around and understand. And I love, Sabrina, what you said about finding the adventure in it, and Vicki, you know, looking for the positive. So creating ways that we can better understand and grow from this experience.
I appreciate that. Bonnie and Vicki specifically, are there, you know, in your populations, are there signs that a parent, you know, or caregiver should look to indicate that their child, or even the parent, may be experiencing some level of trauma that, you know, you're starting to see more often than not?
Absolutely. Well, we tell our parents and caregivers that if the child is different than they were before, so perhaps they were, you know, very outgoing and now they're not, or very adventuresome and now they're not, or the opposite, you know, before they were, you know, quiet and now they're screaming for attention. Maybe they were an overachiever or an underachiever, but anytime they change kind of their composition of who they are and how they function in the world is an indicator that something's going on. And so it's just a red light, I guess I would say, or caution light, not always red. I don't want to hog all the time, so I'm gonna let everybody talk.
Bonnie, any thoughts on that?
No, Vicki, thank you so much. And, you know, for our kids, especially those who have experienced a loss to suicide, many now come forward after grieving the death. And, you know, people are saying, oh, your dad was a hero. And the child may say, well, actually, things were pretty tough at home. And at their own, you know, age appropriate way, describe a situation that was difficult for them. So meeting that child where they are and understanding that they are grieving a different type of loss in each case. It is a unique experience. So Vicki, thank you for spotlighting that.
You know, that's something big, and Shea, I want to offer you an opportunity to answer that. But you know, the way that everyone's processing this through COVID, and the way that everyone's coming out of this, in some cases, like for me, in my case personally, I lost 5 people that I know during COVID. And so there was a way that I kind of processed that, having that conversation where my kids understood one of those folks was a cousin, but kind of distant. And so they couldn't understand it, but that was coming behind them. Their grandparents having passed in the last few years. And so there's a compounding. Shea, are you having this conversation? And then Sabrina, maybe this, you can chime in here. How are you seeing the differences in how people are handling this? And not just the children, but even in the military sector, how are folks handling the loss and then still having to have to go to work and engage with the folks that they work with on a daily basis?
So what I typically see is actually those stages of grief that we typically kind of go through. And so we see the numbness kind of coming up. We see people searching, trying to make sense out of what's going on. This disorientation and disorganization kind of happening. And then at the end, or the tail end, which they're not linear, you have this kind of reorganization, trying to put things back together and move forward. But one of the things that I typically will highlight with parents is that when we're looking at grief in children, it is different, and they don't grieve in the same ways that adults do. And so typically for children, grief looks like depressive-like symptoms, which depressive-like symptoms in children doesn't look the same as adults either. So we have withdrawal, we have preoccupation with things, we have even anxiety and physical symptoms, which are telltale signs in adults. But for children, you typically will get a lot of physical symptoms like headaches, stomach aches, and those kinds of things, not wanting to do things that they usually enjoy, wanting to be hyper-focused on something that seems to calm their concerns, but also it quelches the anxiety that typically will come up because of the level of uncertainty that's kind of been going there. And so you'll see a lot of interactions with a lot of different systems when children start grieving and we not really know what's going on. You see an uptick in doctor's visits. You see an uptick in absconding, maybe not absconding, but missing school days, things of that nature, a little bit more resistance at home. And so that's when that dialogue starts. And so typically what I do is I give my families, when I do family therapy, a list of questions that stimulate discussion. And it is pretty broad. And really what it does is just supposed to get you there and build that trust in the relationship, because sometimes the trauma that we experience in home, similar to what Sabrina said when she mentioned the ACEs, sometimes the trauma that we experience as children actually comes from an adult or a caregiver. And similar to what Bonnie said when we talk about suicide survivors, yeah, that trauma happened in the home. And so how do I know that the parent who's married to the person who completed suicide isn't also going to leave? And so we have a lot of avenues to kind of see what's going on in the family.
Sabrina, thank you for that, Shea. Are there particular things that Sesame Street is doing to address all the things that Shea kind of just talked about?
Oh, of course. I think, I always love to share that, because, Sesame Street is actually, we're not experts. We rely on experts to create our resources. They tell us what to do, like what the need is, how we should respond. And then we translate that into the magic of Muppets, right? With Big Bird being 6-year-old little boy and how would he respond to it? And, all of the work we've done on grief is actually it all started with military families when we first started our program back in 2006. And we were addressing, of course, deployments and then homecomings. But then when parents weren't coming back home, how do you talk to a little one about that? And I think what was brilliant about grief, and I know this is a little bit more dated, but when we first addressed it on the show with Big Bird, when Mr. Hooper, who was the original store owner, passed away, we didn't replace him. We talked about it on the show, and Big Bird, as a 6-year-old, kids don't understand the permanency of death. He was like, oh, he's gone, but he'll be back. So I'm drawing a picture. I'll see him next week. So, for kiddos, especially young ones, we created resources to talk about these things. We have Elma, whose Uncle Jack had passed away. So sharing these sort of videos and stories with kids, and then giving parents those kind of talking points and strategies to continue the conversation, as Shea said, like those list of questions. Young kids, you have to explain it very concretely because Vicki was saying, like, their imagination runs wild, so they can think anything. Or they, again, with the permanency, if you say, oh, they passed away or went to sleep, it's a gentler language, but for kids, it's like, oh, okay, then they'll wake up again. So it's really, I think, important to use as much concrete language, and then sharing with them that, I think a fear kids might have is, well, if that person died, you can die as my parent. So how do you address that, and reassuring them that, no one can make that promise, but we're going to take care of ourselves. And I'm doing everything I can to keep myself healthy and strong. And of course, with kids who may not be as verbal, some of the strategies and resources we have is, alternate ways of communicating. Young kids, especially drawing pictures, acting out their feelings, using pretend play, music. So strategies like that to really start those conversations. And I know, Darnell, you said, what about the parents? I think one of the things, we always forget is, like, how do we really help our parents with self-care? They do so much for their kids, and then, especially something with the death and the pain they must feel, they need to take care of themselves. So we have some articles on that, because it's like, right, it's like when you're on an airplane, you have to put the mask on first before you do it for your child. So you have to be in a good place and make sure you're taking care and meeting your needs so you can support your child in the best way.
I appreciate that, Sabrina. I want to come to Bonnie, because you mentioned something about this, about suicide, and maybe this is a Bonnie, Shea, and anybody else, feel free. During this COVID timeframe, can we talk about what suicide looks like, and can we talk about how that has impacted the home, and how that's, particularly from a veteran standpoint, has there been an uptick? And I don't know the answer to this question. Has there been an uptick? How has that impacted the home? How has that impacted children? Bonnie, I just want to come to you.
Yeah, and it's been for a number of years now for TAPS, the leading cause of death among the surviving families who come to us. Last year, we had over 7,500 newly bereaved family members who came to TAPS, and the majority of those were children in our population. So it is a very large group who have suffered that type of loss. Once a year, we do a national gathering with a good grief camp just of those children, giving them an opportunity in their age groups to talk honestly and openly, kind of normalize their experience as best they can. But it's so important to put words around it. And Vicki has been in those sessions. She has witnessed that. And Vicki, I'd love to have you share some of the insights that you've gained seeing our children of suicide loss interacting and connected with their military mentors, who I think wouldn't come to a grief group for themselves or maybe deal with some of the tough topics around suicide. But when we pair them with a child to be a mentor, suddenly it's a whole different opportunity for them to speak honestly and openly.
And what Bonnie said is so true. They need to be with their peers and they feel safe and the environment is conducive to the dialogue for the child as well as the mentors. But unfortunately, we think that people don't want to talk about suicide, whether it's kids or adults, and they're desperate to do it. They need outlets. They need to normalize and figure out, what this is and how it is. For the kids as caregivers, if you can help a child find the words to explain to somebody else what happened, because people say, my dad died, how did he die? And that's where they just start stumbling because they don't know how to say it without saying it. And we want to protect them from suicide, and suicide is real in our world. And, we need to talk about it. We need to use language that is honoring the deceased as well as the families, the survivors. So many times our media says, somebody committed suicide, and our families have told us over and over, we don't like the word committed. Committed sounds like a sin or sounds like they need to be in jail. They took their own life. They died by suicide. They made a choice, whatever words works for the family. But kids really do want to talk about it. And we have to open those avenues to let them do that.
Oh, Vicki, I love that. And we had a little child who I thought explained it beautifully. Their understanding was, they said, the bad man inside my daddy's head killed my good daddy. I thought that was a really insightful way to think about, that there were sort of two forces at work, and it was inside his head, that it was a mental challenge. So
my guess is he didn't come to that conclusion by himself, that somebody sat with him and kind of worked with him and talked him through. Somebody who wasn't afraid to have the conversation. I will tell you, Bonnie mentioned the mentors being a part of those groups. When they come to help the kids, all of a sudden they become very open and full of an opportunity to talk and share with each other, or, it's just creating the right environment is so important. And Shea said it a while ago when he said, the first thing you do is have the conversation.
So
no matter what the topic is.
No, I appreciate that. One of the things, and then using myself again, we've been intentional, and the key word is intentional, about stopping. I don't know if John's on here. I stop at 5:00 every day, and I get off the computer, and I said, John, he's our CEO. So John, I'm telling him where I stop, and I just engage. I go outside and play basketball. I go throw the football. My daughter's learning to drive, and so I go drive, and we just talk, and I just let them talk. And I don't want to know anything more about Minecraft or Roblox for my youngest, or I don't really care about the playoffs right now. They're pretty boring in basketball, but my middle son wants to talk. And then infused in there is, man, this was a tough day. Or infused in there is, hey, can I ask you a question about this? I'm nervous. What do you think about the shot for teenagers, Dad? And, all those things. And so my wife and I are intentional. I take that time frame, and then she takes the later time frame, or she does the early morning and she cooks the breakfast and she's talking with them then. And so I appreciate you guys saying that. And so my question for that is, we've been talking about children, but what about the adults, right? So what about the adults that have to take care of the children. Shea, and I want to come to you, but this is a Vicki, Bonnie, Sabrina question as well. How do the adults, and what are the tools that you guys have been providing for the adults to take care of themselves so that they can take care of the whole?
Gotcha. So typically what I do when I work with the adults, which I always work with adults when I'm working with children because there's no way to get to the child without the adult. So many people that train just to work with kids are quite surprised when they have to also work with the parents. And so what I typically do is I do a routine. I have them list out what their routine is, similar to what you're talking about, Darnell. And if there aren't those periods of time where the family actually interacts, then I have them do those pointed interactions to build that level of communication and trust. And so many of the children have a lack of trust in something, the system and parents and friends, whatever it might be. And the only way to really build trust is with consistency and predictability. And so I encourage the parents to, as Sabrina mentioned earlier, self-care and figure out, okay, I start off with parents with sleep routine. I know I'm a father of 3 as well. And so sleeping, what is that? You know, that kind of question generally, and try and ensure that they have a good sleep routine in place, and then ensure that their eating habits are consistent, ensure that they have good, healthy habits related to healthy boundaries with work, similar to how you were mentioning, Darnell, getting off work at 5. And when we're trying to have these conversations or just attend to our children, that our cell phones are not there, creating a distraction. And even if it's not, 65% of our body language is communicated versus what we actually say. And so if I'm telling you I'm listening, but I'm on my cell phone, what am I actually telling you is happening in the moment? And so typically that's kind of where I go. And if it's a parental dyad that's still together, I encourage them to spend time together as well. And so I force, some people would say force, I highly suggest that there is a date night at least once a month. And if you can get a date night in more frequently, that's great. And if not, then we'll work around it to ensure, and we kind of think outside of the box, especially during COVID, order something, bring it home, kids go to bed at 8:30, 9 o'clock, candlelit dinner happens right then and there between the parents. Boom, we have that connection where we feel appreciated. That's when we see a reduction in mental health symptoms. You feel valued, you feel appreciated, you feel seen, you feel included, all of those things across the board, whether it's in your family, it's at work, or in your friend group. That's typically how I approach working with the parents.
Yeah, Darnell, this is in our population, so often there is only one surviving parent. So there isn't the opportunity to, really have that date night. And that is tough. There is no respite. So I so appreciate what Easterseals provides and other organizations and opportunities to have a little bit of respite care. What we do with our military mentor program to bring, another adult into the family to be a support, to be another voice. But our camps now that we do for kids are family camps. So we bring the parent or guardian along. They do some separate activities, but they're learning parallel coping strategies. So that when they go home, there is that ongoing continuance of what they've learned. And it really has been a beautiful opportunity to help that family, that surviving family, now move forward.
One of the tools that we love to use is homework, but we empower the child to assign the homework to the adult. So we say to the child, okay, you have permission now. You need to go home and tell mom and dad they have homework, whoever is their significant caregiver. And it's questions to facilitate good conversations on feelings, on changes, on loss, on celebrations. It really is just a way to put the child in that empowering role and to have that special time.
And Darnell, I just have to add, you cannot rule out Sesame Street when you're talking about the parents. One strategy.
No, that's why, hey, I speak at it occasionally. It takes me back to a long time ago.
I'll give an example. So one of our big strategies, of course, one of the protective factors around trauma is, how do we help kids feel safe? So one of those strategies we have is this beautiful game, video, and storybook, different mediums. So we're really sending the same messaging in different ways for kids to learn. And it's about Big Bird having big feelings, feeling unsafe. So he creates in his imagination, and it's guided through the help of Alan, his caring adult, on creating a safe space, which is his comfy, cozy nest. So the game is so beautiful. There's breathing exercises. He's building this nest. There's some meditation activities. And, you know, we partnered with actually the drug courts. And what we heard from their mentors is this is a wonderful game for kids and parents. And everything we do is co-watching, co-playing. The kids should not be doing any of these activities on their own. And they told us how, well, parents were doing this themselves, and it helped them calm down. It helped them come to the sessions more prepared. Seeing Big Bird doing something like this helped them think about their own childhood trauma in many ways and start having those conversations. So yeah, I think there's opportunities with, like, you know, back to the self-care, the meditation. There's you know, even before this webinar, I did our, you know, breathing game. So I'd be ready to go so I could be calm and centered. So I always go back to that when we're thinking about how do we really support the adults.
Well, Sabrina, just so you know, my favorite Sesame Streets are when they do the music. So it kind of has some churchy themes in there. So when I'll have to send you a couple of those. My kids are like, Dad, that's from like 1970. I'm like, be quiet. We're not dating. Do not date your father here. But yes, I appreciate that. So Sesame Street is still a pillar in our home. So I appreciate that. You know, as we're talking about the adults and we're talking about the children, one of the big things that is coming out of this is change, right? So hopefully there's some learned things that we're seeing. My wife's an educator, and she's like, I hope educators are paying attention to the things that are good that are coming out of COVID, right? And so I would ask each of you to take a turn. Like, what is something that you've seen during this traumatic time frame that has made us stop and re-envision what we're doing? And I'll start with you, Bonnie.
You know, it is an opportunity to come together as families. And, you know, the time at home in lockdowns has been a blessing and a curse, but hopefully out of the blessing, we have taken the opportunity to interact more frequently and to come back to the love that we have for each other, and, you know, really reconnect and get to know each other, to establish healthy habits, to maybe eat more home cooked meals and think about our nutritional intake, to exercise on a regular schedule. I love, you know, what you were saying about setting that schedule at 5 o'clock every day and what you can do to establish routines, to even get better sleep because you're on that more routine cycle. And I hope so much of that will stick with us, that we can continue to have that discipline in our lives. So some of the positive things.
No, I appreciate that. Vicki?
A couple of things. One is that I think creativity is such a great tool for good mental health against negative situations. And so we've seen so many families come together and try to use that creativity skill and have a joint project or joint decision making and a combined effort where it was a shared experience. I think kids have more insight right now into what a parent does for work, and you know, kind of knows more. Maybe there's positive and negative about the parent on a daily basis. From a professional point of view, one of the blessings that we had is that by being forced to offer so many things virtual, including counseling and peer support groups, we've reached a larger audience. So there's a lot of rural America that really is very underserved in services and programs. They don't have a system of nonprofits who, you know, help in every small community in America. And now those people really have better access to really strong programs and services. So I don't think we'll go back. You know, I don't think that's one of the things that will carry forward out of COVID, is the ability to reach beyond the physical space.
I appreciate that. Reach beyond, you know, and then I want to come to you, Sabrina, and then you, Shea. I would 1000% agree that I think the boundaries are endless now. There's been a lot of conversation of making, you know, accessibility into wireless and other, you've heard of people driving buses into rural communities and creating it so that folks could chime in, because you're also learning, unfortunately, there's an economic divide, not just a color divide or a diversity divide. There's a huge economic divide in America where we assume because I have a cell phone and GPS and I can do anything on it, there's tons of folks that are in rural communities, Black, white, Asian, all different colors, that didn't even have access to that. And so we've learned a lot through this. And so I hope that from this conversation and others, that there is a continued push for there to be more access. And maybe that is access. So Sabrina, your thoughts?
Yeah, no, and I'm happy. Thank you for giving. I'm happy I wasn't picked on first because I was thinking about it. Two things came up, especially from COVID, and maybe this isn't the most positive way to go about it, but what we're really seeing is coming back. Kids have a lot of kids have missed out on a year of schooling. We've seen that some of the struggles that more vulnerable families feel or have experienced, like food insecurity, access to resources, have been amplified. So I think there's a big job ahead for especially providers and systems to address that in the next year to come, in the years to come, to make sure we're accommodating that. And then just separately, because this has been so central to Sesame Street in this last year, just what we've seen. And just like Vicki, you were talking about, don't let your kids watch the 10 o'clock news, but with what's going on with racial and social justice, right? How do we come back and, reintroduce, because we've always done this, but we need to do this more and better, conversations about empathy and diversity and identity, building those really as the forefront of our curriculum and system. So just some of those things I know that we're really looking ahead of and how we can support, particularly the providers, since we're not direct service at Sesame, but how do we support the providers, the educators, the healthcare systems, so that they can then support the families. Oh, Darnell, you're muted.
I know. Look, I was trying.
I read your lips. I heard my name.
But you're right. You saw I said Shea, like I was about to say something bad about you. But no, seriously, thank you, Sabrina, for teeing me up. And I had written this down. Shea, it happens that you're a Black man and you also happen to be a Black clinician. And it's not left upon all of us here that during 2020, we've also had some other challenges in the diversity space, right? And so not only are we talking about suicides, not only are we talking about food deserts, not only are we talking about lack of access, particularly for our children and for military, but there's also this diversity piece that gets lumped on top of people of color who are in low access, low reach areas. Can you spend a minute or two speaking there? Before you go there, though, we're at about 15 minutes to go here, folks. If you have questions, please ask. We want to make sure that you get a chance to ask these wonderful panelists who are super smart and indebted in their space some questions. So please ask now. And I appreciate that none of you have really left this conversation, so thank you. This will be posted afterwards. And then lastly, Shea, after we come to you, we're going to circle back to everybody and offer everyone a chance to have some party words. Shea, go ahead.
Okay. One of the things that I did not mention before is that my primary focus in treatment has been with African-American families. And so generally speaking, what I do is I consult with organizations to talk about diversity, inclusion, and primarily unconscious bias. So prior to coming here, I worked at a large academic medical institution where I helped train the medical students, because they are sometimes the first line of defense when we think about mental health treatment, because many people go for physical symptoms versus mental health symptoms. And so typically that's the avenue that I kind of engage. So when I'm talking to educators, when I'm talking to the students, we talk about difference and we talk about, well, what is it about this situation that makes this person different? Or is it that we have different beliefs? And how do we come from these divergent beliefs together and be more flexible and understanding? And we talk about how unconscious bias is really everyday bias, the bias that we all have. I have biases about pregnant women. I have biases about doctors. I have biases about all these kinds of things that you don't realize until you shine a light on it. And shining a light on it doesn't mean that we're calling people racist or we're calling people bigots or we're saying all these negative things about people. We're saying that you're human, right? Because one thing, as you mentioned earlier, Darnell, is that there's a lot of change happening. And so when change happens, and when we think about it neurologically, our bodies attempt to understand the world by putting the world into categories. And those categories are created in infancy, technically, because children that are 6 months old can actually differentiate between their parents. And so being able to categorize things quickly allow us to function from our medulla oblongata, where we are trying to do this fight or flight, right? And so this is a part of the traumatic experience as well. So it's tied together very seamlessly here when we're thinking about the difference that's in a room. I might feel activated. For what reason? Well, individuals in this particular space or individuals that look like these types of people have been either consciously or unconsciously communicated to me as unsafe individuals. And so what we typically do in therapy is we talk about, so what is it about this situation that's create a level of discomfort? And we talk about what is your level of discomfort as you kind of matriculate through this process. And then we challenge those thoughts. So we do some cognitive restructuring and reframing. So what lends support to this, or what evidence do you have to disprove whatever this concern actually is? And having that conversation is really, really important, because it helps the children understand that I can be different from other people and other people can be different from me, and we can still agree to disagree, or we can still see eye to eye. There's something in each aspect that we can actually pull from and be the
Yeah, I
same.
appreciate that. Thank you very, very much. So again, last 10 minutes. What I'd like to do in the last 10 minutes is offer each panelist a chance to leave us with something that they would want us to walk away from, and to share any links, anything else like that. I want to start with Vicki, since you were last but not least last. So now you get to go first, Ms. Vicki.
Thank you. I was just typing in the chat, so I'll finish that in a minute.
No problem.
But thank you first again for just your interest in the topic. Whatever brought you to this webinar that today, that shows that you have a need or an interest. You know, we all want to help. We're all here to do the same. The National Alliance for Grieving Children is a network. We know that pre-COVID, there's 1 in 14 children who will experience the death of a sibling or a parent before they graduate, before they reach the age of 18. And then that doubles when you talk about young adults, very much like Darnell's kids. So there's a huge number of kids that experience death every single day across our United States, not because of COVID, not because of military, because of life. And we need to do everything we can to support those kids. I firmly believe that starting the conversation, being comfortable with ourselves, is the first step on any of these topics, whether it be suicide or the racial injustice. We've got to know who we are. So we all have this inside work to do, and then connect to resources. The NAGC website is Children Grieve. So it's www.childrengrieve.org. There are a ton of resources, whether you're a professional, and very specific resources and webinars that are available. Then we also have downloadable free to people who are in need of resources to work directly with kids. 4 of the ones that I'd mentioned is how to talk to kids about death. You know, you mentioned not replacing the grocer on Sesame Street. That's an opportunity. We miss a lot of opportunities to talk to kids every single day about death. When the dead bird is laying on the sidewalk, we kick it out of the way instead of pausing to say, let's talk about this dead bird. And we do that not because the child is uncomfortable, but because we're uncomfortable with it. So I want to challenge everybody here to get comfortable with talking about hard things. There's a resource on how to talk about funerals and how to prepare a child to attend and participate in a funeral, help them understand whatever the ritual is, not just funerals. And then how, as a family, how do you grieve and recognize that everybody grieves differently within that family, although they're connected to the same loss? And that's so important, because we don't often look beyond ourselves. We think that everybody is like us means everybody grieves like us and hurts like us. We don't ever compare loss, but we need to recognize the uniqueness of everybody's loss. So I hope that you'll all, and it goes right back to how Darnell started. 3 children processed 3 different ways. 4 children are going to process 4 different ways.
Absolutely.
And the last thing I would say is Bonnie and I had a conversation earlier. It's not a one and done. So we just can't say, okay, we've done that and now we're going to go on to whatever. This is a lifetime of change. We've all been affected by COVID. We've all experienced loss and change and disappointment and trauma this year. And it's not going to be over with. There's not a switch to flip. It becomes a part of who we are, and it's what we take forward with us. And so just recognizing that as we move on. Thank you.
I appreciate that. Thank you so very much. Sabrina, I want to come to you. We've got 6 minutes. 6 minutes. Let's go, guys.
I will be quick. So no, thank you again for having Sesame Street here. We know that 1 in 4 kids struggle or have had a traumatic experience. And, John said at the beginning, Sesame Street's mission is to make all kids smarter, stronger, and kinder. And we know trauma affects children's ability to learn, creating obstacles to make them smarter. It affects their physical and mental health, so they're likely to grow up stronger. And then most importantly, how they interact with the world that can make it difficult for them to be kinder. So I shared the link. So that's really why we created Sesame Street in Communities. The heart of our work and all these resources is looking at it from a perspective of trauma-informed care. I know there's so many parents out there today. So I just wanted to highlight the different breadth of resources we have. Some of the examples even Vicki gave, we have videos I always call our bread and butter, but using videos to model the strategies for kids, using Elmo, Big Bird, having these conversations. Games and storybooks, which are interactive ways parents can continue that conversation. Printable, so you're not just doing screen time all day. Take that conversation offline. And I think what's most important is our articles that we've created for our parents. They're less than 350 words. I know to all of you parents out there, time is of the essence and our working parents. So, how do we give you those strategies, tips, conversation points around these sort of conversations? And then for all of our providers out there who are serving families, we have a whole section of professional development resources, from videos that are short to webinars, courses, interactive guides, and so please check out Sesame Street in Communities. And feel free to email me if you have any questions.
Sabrina, I really appreciate that. Bonnie, you've got 1 minute, 30 seconds, and then Shea, you'll get 30 seconds.
No, I echo what everyone said. Thank you for the opportunity. TAPS is the organization for all those grieving the loss of a military loved one. We have resources at taps.org, but just to reframe the conversation about grief in general, as human beings, we only grieve because we love. And the love that we have transcends the physical existence, and that love lives on. So for our kids, we can redefine that relationship that they have, because that person who died will always be part of their life. It will always be someone who they remember, who inspires them, who they can continue to learn from. So this has been a wonderful experience just to delve deeper into it, but that's my takeaway.
Bonnie, I appreciate you. I just want to know, can I get one of those shirts? I really would like one of those shirts. I love the shirt. I appreciate, I like that. So Shea, please, last but not least this time, I'll put the gentleman for the last, and then I'll close this out. Go ahead.
Thank you, Darnell. The only thing that I would like to just end on, since I'm an Easterseals ambassador, all of our resources are located out there on the website, is that change is the only thing that we can count on to be consistent in life. And one way to ensure that we are healthy adults is adapting to that change and being able to generalize that adaptation from one changing cycle or experience or transition to another. And so if you find that there are difficulties adjusting to a transition, then that means that we need additional tools and resources that Sabrina, Vicki, and Bonnie have already kind of highlighted for us. And so we're here, mental health professionals, as well as other professionals.
So let me just say, I've enjoyed a lot of panels. I truly enjoyed this one. Thank you guys so very much for being here today. My name is Darnell Burtin. Bonnie, Vicki, Shea, Sabrina, you guys are rock stars and awesome smiles. On behalf of Easterseals, DC, Maryland, Virginia, we thank you all for joining us.